a year ago, the Urban Mission Task Force chose the theme, Seeking the Welfare of the City. A primary resource for that theme was a paper drafted by the Reverend Kevin Johnson and myself while we were serving on the Advisory Committee on Social Witness Policy of the PCUSA. The 2014 GA meeting here in Detroit overwhelmingly adopted the Gospel from Detroit as social witness policy for our denomination. The GA recognized that the serious urban crisis faced by Detroit was not unique to Detroit, that the forces that shape Detroit are not unique to Detroit, and that the abandonment of the city by white Christians did not happen only in Detroit. But in light of that abandonment, the GA called on presbyteries to pursue a renewal of their urban ministries, one grounded in a theologically informed study of the city's history and the city's current context, as we did in the document, The Gospel from Detroit. St. Paul, speaking from his own experience of transformation, gives us hope when he challenges us not to be conformed to this world. Transformed by the grace of God as he was, we will not assess value as the world does. We will not define normal as the world does. We will not organize and do business as the world does. So this morning, I'm going to be looking specifically at Detroit, but you could be doing this to your town, Pontiac or Flint or wherever you live. But we are not to see through the eyes of buildings and billionaires, not through the eyes of fear or disgust, and not through the eyes of pity. We are challenged to see through the eyes of Christ, discerning the meaning for our time and place of the prophet's call to seek the welfare of the city. Still, it is only going to be with God's grace that we can honestly face our past in order to understand and reform our present and work energetically to become the beloved community. First, we need to understand how Detroit became the Detroit of today, including the stark reduction of Presbyterian ministries within it. From 44 churches with 36 full-time pastors in 1960 to 11 churches and only 4 full-time pastors today, only one of whom is African American. This is not going to be an easy or comfortable task, so talk about stepping on toes this morning. It's hard to look back at our church's past and see how Christians could tragically succumb to cultural norms that make a mockery of God's purposes. But seeing how they could be captured by national myths, informed by false memories, kept ignorant by lost memories, misguided by generalities, and seduced by explanations that justify and mock the suffering of others, we can be forewarned. Some today like to talk about there being 2 Detroits. Midtown and downtown is one, and then there is the rest. Midtown and downtown are celebrated as beacons of a bright future. It's fueled by wealthy private investors and hundreds of millions of public development funds, cheap land, and tax abatements. But for the rest, the data will describe a sobering legacy of economic and racial exclusion. With the eyes of faith, we need to look behind the numbers to see the children, the women, and the men, young and old, caught in the violence of economic and racial isolation. In our theologically informed study of the history of Detroit, we found 2 cultural myths that profoundly shaped Detroit, its people, and its churches. The first is the myth of race. A couple of weeks ago, my sister emailed me a question. She wanted to know how I would respond to her neighbors in the northwest corner of Georgia who were telling her that Jesus had to have been white because, after all, he was a Jew and he could not have had black skin. My initial response was, what a really stupid question. That's a good academic response. But since the murder of Trayvon Martin, it has become abundantly clear that race is a deadly, serious matter in a culture that equates whiteness with both human and godly norms. So we cannot understand how Detroit became the city it is today, or how to seek its welfare, without understanding the power of the myth of race. This is going to be quick. Simply put, race is a lie. There's no biological basis for it. It's not true that humans have always divided ourselves into races. Separating people into races and then justifying the enslavement of one group on the basis of the race assigned to it was a brand new idea in the 1600s, created by my ancestors, property-owning white folk. My ancestors had a huge need for cheap labor, cheap agricultural labor, but indentured English servants had some legal rights and could appeal to a judge for protection of them. Africans had no legal standing or protectors. The solution was chattel slavery for the most defenseless humans, Africans. Over the next centuries, there would be justified by experts in law, science, and religion. They would develop and deepen this lie called race. 250 years later, slavery ended, but race did not. I was a history major, but I never knew how, for the next 100 years, white Christian citizens would create laws, regulations, policies, and customs intent on and very successful at replicating the fear, intimidation, inequality, and control of people of color that slavery used to do. Black codes denied equal civil rights specifically to Black Americans. Jim Crow laws were judged constitutional by the highest courts. Unspeakable violence, North and South, was unleashed upon the bodies of Black Christians by white Christians, keeping in place a system of rigid segregation affecting every aspect of life: jobs, voting, schools, healthcare, transportation, residence, and yes, worship. Detroit was no exception. Hundreds of race riots scarred Detroit well into the 1960s as white folk rioted to keep Black folk out of our jobs and our neighborhoods. This is a very uncomfortable history, but I think it raises profound theological questions, which, by the way, were never a part of my seminary education. I had to read theology written by Black Christian theologians in order to start seeing. The Reverend Dr. Katie Cannon, first African-American woman to be ordained in the PCUSA, teaches at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond. She writes, quote, "I first began pondering the relationship between faith and ethics as a schoolgirl. My community of faith taught me the principles of God's universal personhood, embracing the equal humanity of all people. Yet my city, state, and nation declared it a punishable offense against the laws for Blacks and whites to travel, eat, defecate, wait, be buried, make love, play, relax, and even speak together, except in the stereotyped context of master and servant interaction. My religious quest was one of trying to relate the Christian doctrines preached in the Black church to the suffering, oppression, and exploitation of Black people in the society. How could Christians who were white flatly and openly refuse to treat as fellow human beings Christians who had African ancestry?" Unquote. Ancient history. My neighbor Bill and I have carried on many conversations over the years and over the fence that separates our driveways. A few weeks ago, we were talking, and Bill said that the best place he had ever been was in Canada. Where, I asked. Montreal, he said. What's so great about Montreal? He said, there I was a human being. My neighbor Bill is a black man, my age, born and raised in Detroit. Dr. James Cone is a minister in the AME Church and a professor of theology at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. In his most recent book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, Dr. Cone describes his own childhood, living in fear of the violence white folk could do with impunity. His book describes the black community's history of enduring rampant white violence. School openings could be delayed or church ended early to allow whole white families to attend the torture, burning, and lynching of a black soul. He asks, how could white Christians who find Christ in a crucified Jesus not be able to see Jesus in these broken black bodies? Ancient history or an essential question for today? Kelly Brown Douglas is an Episcopal priest, a canon at the National Cathedral, director of religion at Goucher College in Baltimore, the author of 4 books, and the mother of a son. The killing of Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of his killer, the killing of Jordan Davis, age 17, then Jonathan Farrow, age 24, and Renisha McBride, age 19, and now so many more, has deeply troubled her. She writes, I became acutely aware that perhaps the only place my black male child was safe was in my home. Every time he leaves the house, I pray, God, please be my eyes and my hands. Watch over my son and bring him safely home. I tremble at the thought that the world is not safe for our sons, unquote. I too am the mother of a son, but I have never had to worry about the harm that could come to him because of the color of his skin or the loudness of his car radio. Today we gather after an election that has revealed to us aspects of our national character, the existence of which many of us would have denied just a year ago. About a week ago, Stephen Henderson wrote a stunning, at least I think it's stunning, piece in the Detroit Free Press, a true cry from the heart. When asked how he felt about the election, he writes, quote, I feel frightened and worried. For the first time ever after a presidential election, that's how my family feels, unquote. Stephen Henderson is a native of Detroit, a newspaper editor, a Pulitzer Prize awardee. And as a black man, father to 2 sons, he lives in Detroit today in fear. How can I, a white Christian, understand his fear? How can I, a white Christian, respond? The issue to me is deeply theological. And for the first time in 20 or 30 years, I'm going to quote John Calvin. As John Calvin warned us, without true knowledge of self, we fail at truly knowing God. And I would add, truly loving neighbor. As I look on my city, Detroit, I have to interrogate myself. Does the myth of race still give me assumptions about race that justify the pain and devastation I see there, and numbing my heart? Do I dismiss their fears because I've always been an American? As we who are white Christians seek the welfare of this city, what don't we know that we don't know we don't know? Why is the Detroit metropolitan area the most segregated metropolitan area in the United States? The city of Detroit is about 83% black and less than 10% white. The counties around it are just the reverse. This residential segregation sustains continuing school segregation. Michigan is the 4th most segregated state for black students, in the nation, with a little over 50% of African Americans attending schools that are 90 to 100% minority. This residential segregation continues to block equal access to the basic resources people need to flourish. Jobs and income, food, education, public transportation, medical care, banking, and churches. But it also serves to limit what white folk know about ourselves, about the intended or unintended consequences of our beliefs and behaviors. It limits our knowledge of Black Christians, and it can be limiting our moral sensitivity. Race still matters. A second powerful myth our study of Detroit revealed is the myth of the riot. Moving here in 1992, I learned that Detroit is a city of two tales, two contesting explanations. Most white folk I talked to told me that the downfall of Detroit began 50 years ago with the riot. In 1967, 8,000 National Guard troops, 5,000 paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Army Division, tanks, guns, and tear gas on the streets of Detroit to quell Black rioters. After the riot, white folk naturally fled from irrational Black violence, and a great city decayed in the hands of Black leaders. This is a simple but powerful story of white innocence and Black guilt. So after moving here, suburban friends would look up and down my street and they would say to me, "Is this a Black neighborhood? Aren't you afraid to come home by yourself?" Digging deeper, we discovered a different story, one that fills in what the other story doesn't tell. This is a story that begins back in the 1940s of car and auto supply manufacturers closing factories and moving out of the city for cheaper taxes, cheaper land, and cheaper labor. It includes the federal government's actions to decentralize the city's manufacturing base to protect us from enemy attack, and to develop a highway system to support decentralization and suburbanization. This story describes how white folk and white Presbyterians and white churches followed those jobs out into new, legally segregated suburbs. With the support of a GI Bill of Rights and FHA financing, white families could move and buy houses in white neighborhoods. Meanwhile, the FHA was redlining Black and mixed neighborhoods, denying the possibility of home ownership and the accumulation of equity for Black families. So this is a story of how Detroit lost half its manufacturing jobs and over 500,000 white residents before 1960, well before the riot. Left behind, with empty hulks of factories, closed bars, closed restaurants, cleaners, grocery stores, and yes, closed churches, were poor whites and people of African descent as political and economic power shifts to suburbia. Historian Tom Segru's History of Detroit comes to this conclusion. Discrimination and deindustrialization proved to be a lethal combination for Blacks. They still do. The Detroit of today is a result of economic abandonment. It's part of that Rust Belt story that was so important in the recent election. In cities, this loss of industry created what sociologist William Julius Wilson calls the new urban poverty. It is a jobless poverty for those left behind. The election exposed the spread of that joblessness into the suburbs and rural areas, the effects of automation, the effects of globalization, now bringing hardship and despair to the white working class. But decades ago, racial segregation laid that burden on the Black working class left behind in an economically devastated city. But once again, the myth of race proved false explanations of Black poverty and a convenient scapegoat on which to blame the growing pain and destitution among white workers. Today, the rest of Detroit faces these tragic realities. On the right side of this slide, you see Detroit's median household income at somewhat less than $27,000 a year, while Oakland County is over 66,000 and Macomb County is about 54,000. On the left side of this slide, you see Detroit's impoverishment. Today, Detroit is the most impoverished big city in the United States. Almost 40% of its population lives below the poverty line for a family of 4. Its unemployment rate hovers around 14%, which is about 3 times the state of Michigan's unemployment rate. In 2014, the city's decision to shut off water to thousands of households too poor to pay their bills created an international outcry and an investigation by the United Nations. The poverty rate for Macomb County is around 12%, and for Oakland County, it is around 10%. There's no disagreement among anyone about the long-term serious effects of child poverty on human development. Yet of the nation's 50 largest city, Detroit ranks highest in the percentage of children, 67%, living in areas of concentrated poverty. 59% of our children live in official poverty. A 2014 report by the United Way found that 67% of Detroit's families can't afford to adequately meet basic needs like housing and health care, even when family members are employed. Working a full-time job at Michigan's minimum wage, $8.15, still leaves a family of 4 $7,000 short of reaching the federal poverty line. Poverty matters. It impacts educational attainment. And the results of the federal NEET test in 2013 are chilling. Fewer than 8% of Detroit's 4th and 8th graders tested proficient or above in math and reading. That's fewer than 8%. Only 2.7% of Detroit's public high school students scored college ready on the standard ACT test. Poverty matters. It impacts health, and asthma is just one example. But Detroit has the highest rate of asthma in young children among America's 18 largest cities. It's a problem that experts say affects children's health and learning for the rest of their lives. The rate of Detroit children's hospitalization for asthma and death from asthma is 3 times that of the state of Michigan. Like many other cities, Detroit has experienced what Tom Segregated calls 2 of the most important interrelated and unresolved problems in American history: that capitalism creates inequality and that communities of color disproportionately bear that burden. So how should we Christians answer the question, do Black lives matter? Answering a resounding yes to that, Detroit has another story to tell, one of resistance and faith. First, resistance. Throughout Detroit today, hundreds of small and mid-sized organizations with small staffs and limited budgets and local volunteers, Black and white folk working together, are at work daily to address the indignities and injustices that threaten human flourishing in our neighborhoods. They take the form of block clubs, neighborhood associations, community organizers, urban farmers, artists and designers, community advocates, churches, and community development corporations, all no profit and little pay. But it is they who are tackling on the ground every day such issues as saving home ownership, neighborhood gardening, resisting foreclosures, blocking water turnoffs, preventive health care, local economic development strategies, vacant homes, beautification projects, local school support, safety, gun violence, environmental pollution, and more. This is not the work of charity. It is the work of justice. Their values stress inclusive local organizing in which the energy, vision, and sense of ownership of residents working together empowers and shapes community action. This is not the work of charity. It is the work of empowerment, which challenges what Rip Rapson, who is the president of the Kresge Foundation, what he calls, quote, persistent racial, economic, and political barriers, unquote. It is to these groups that I would suggest individuals, churches, and this presbytery look to understand what is required to seek the welfare of the people of the city. First, by listening and learning from them, and then by joining with them to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly on the streets of Detroit with Jesus. A word of faith. Our challenge is ultimately theological. Can we see Jesus walking on the streets of Detroit? From the experience of unjust suffering, there is a tradition of Christian faith that knows deep down in its bones, in every family's history, that no one could have survived this history, and no one survives these conditions except by the grace of God. For centuries, this has been the message and the ministry of the Black church, preaching God's redemptive presence within the experience of violent injustice, within the protest against oppression, within the daily struggle for dignity and freedom. The ministry of the Black church for centuries has affirmed the image of God in each Black woman, Black child, and Black man, despite a culture that denied it. So now the challenge is before us. Those of us who are white Christians, our ancestors once abandoned this city. How will we who are white Christians seek its welfare today? Will we support its struggle for justice? Will we support and grow the ministry of the Black church within this city? Will we support these ministries, especially in racially segregated and economically poor neighborhoods? Or does the gospel only come to those who can pay for it? Can we recognize, as the Bible promises, that it is on those streets and in those neighborhoods that we will find the spirit of the God of the Exodus, the spirit of the God of the prophets, the spirit of the God of Jesus, making a way where there is no way, hitting a straight lick with a crooked stick, sustaining sacred personhood in a context meant to destroy it, cherishing the sacred possibilities in every child and woman and man. The promise is that by seeking the welfare of the city, we will find our own welfare. And this, my friends, is the gospel from Detroit. Thank you.
Knowing how isolated most of us white Christians are from Detroit, I'm thinking, would you or somebody connected to Presbytery be able to share some names of organizations to contact in order to take a first step?
But to say this to all of you, the one slide I had up here that had a lot of little logos on it are just a very small example of these organizations. And I'm suggesting that you also go online and go to a group called CDAD, Community Development Advocates of Detroit, and look at their membership list. I can give you guidance, and I'm learning through my program that I'm in, a community development program that really focuses on Detroit, of organizations that you might be interested in. You might approach it in terms of saying, I'm interested in this part of the city, and I want to know what can we do to be part of that justice movement in this part of the city. Or you might say, I have a really burning desire to do something about water. We still have 30,000 households in Detroit where the water is turned off. And the funny thing is, if you're a corporation with a big building, you might have a really big water bill, but if you challenge it, they keep sending you water while that challenge is worked out. But if you're a poor individual and can't pay your water bill and you want to challenge it, they turn off your water as you continue to challenge. And so that's a huge issue. If you're interested in that issue or other issues, environmental issues, pollution issues, we can help to make those connections, and I would be glad to help anyone or come speak to any group who wants to think along those ways. But I think Barb's point is correct. Our eyes don't get opened easily. And it is by being in the community and working with people that we really begin to understand the context and the common humanity that we share.
How do we eradicate the worship service on Sunday morning being the most segregated hour of the week?
Well, I think that sometime in the future that is a final goal. I think right now I would be arguing for the strengthening of the Black church in the city of Detroit because of the rigid segregation that we have. Now, I think that there are techniques of starting to bridge that. And was it Sharon or someone mentioned, yes, Sharon was mentioning about how we can build as liaisons so that white folks can come from the suburbs and worship in a Black church in the city and vice versa, and begin to develop that sense of oneness. But I'm not opposed to the idea, in fact, I'm in favor of the idea, that we really have to focus on empowering the Black churches that are in the city of Detroit right now to be doing Christian ministry and creating Christian community, and that can be aided and enhanced by those who live in suburbia and are more likely to be white and attending a mostly white church.
How do we reconcile the inner city development, Cass Corridor, and the Midtown with the neighborhoods in a way that is supportive to the neighborhoods, is supportive to the development that we are seeing, or is that development simply gentrifying and dragging people out who've been living there?
Well, let's see, are there any politicians in the room? This is my perspective, so take it for what it's worth or not worth. And I can give you an illustration. I attended, not Friday night, Wednesday night and Thursday night, I attended 2 different talks at my university. Wednesday night was sponsored by the Jesuits. I'm at a university in the Catholic tradition, sponsored by the Jesuits, and the person giving the talk has a long time history in Detroit. He is a Black man, and his talk was all about the wonders of Midtown and downtown and how great it all was, and everything's going really well. He never mentioned the data that I gave you this morning. The next night, the talk I went to was presented by a Mercy nun, Mary Ellen Howard, who is on the board of the People's Water Board. She has stood in front of trucks, stopping the trucks from going and turning off people's water. She was arrested, among others, handcuffed, put in a police cruiser, taken off, and charged with violating the law. And she and others are still awaiting trial for this violation. She can tell you stories of people whose water has been turned off, who are handicapped, who are old, who are young families with young children. How do they do without water? It's a public health issue. She's a nurse. So I'm trying to say to you that there are really 2 stark ways in Detroit of looking at this. It is my personal belief, or my question, why is it that suddenly hundreds of millions of dollars of public development funds are rolling into Detroit to partner with very wealthy investors to do what's happening in Midtown and downtown? And yes, gentrification is going out, and people who can't afford the rising rents and prices are being forced out of this area. How will that ever help the neighborhoods when we're talking about the data that I've given you today? And nobody seems to have a handle on the school system. I might also point out to you that some of the data I gave you today, especially the school statistics, in the school statistics for Michigan are similarly horrible. And we're doing a bad job in terms of Christian ethics in many places. Detroit, it's a concentrated location of extreme negative data. So I guess my answer to you is I'm very suspicious of what's happening in Midtown and downtown. Everybody can go down and enjoy the restaurants and whatnot. Corktown is, prices are going up in Corktown as that gentrification moves a couple blocks down Michigan Avenue. I don't see how in any time in the near future, or in fact ever, it's going to make a difference that needs to be made a difference for at least 40% of the Detroit population.
I sense that the real need for us out in the suburbs is to really work at building bridges into the city. And I just wonder if you could say more about how you see that happening, and how do we develop a long-term relationship that I think is needed to build these bridges.
And I think you're right. I think it is by being with one another that we actually begin to recognize what God is calling us to be and to do. And I think there's a number of ways. We talked about how congregations could make relationships and work on those relationships. I have another idea, which I don't know if anybody would be interested in, but there's such a thing as an immersion programs. I mean, we have sent people to various places around the country to experience an immersion thing. I know people who have gone down to Phoenix, Arizona for an immersion experience related to immigration and the border. In my program, the students have to do a capstone project, a team that sets out and sets up a project. And a couple years ago, one of those teams set up a week immersion experience in Detroit. The theme was food justice. And so some young people who wanted to do something good on spring break suddenly found out that they were being told they were going to go to all places, Detroit. They were appalled. But campus ministry took them. What the team did is found a building that someone was renovating to turn it into a hostel. The owner of that building was willing to have these young people and their leaders to stay in that hostel for a week. Every day of that week, they were taken to some aspect related to food justice in the city of Detroit. And at the end of that week experience, that immersion, would you believe that they wanted to move to Detroit? That was pretty amazing. And I think there is the power of doing that. And I'm envisioning using the building, we have buildings in Detroit. You know, we have churches in Detroit that could be used to set up such an immersion so that people who are not understanding of the inner city and its issues and problems could come and spend time there. You know, we'd have to figure out how to design that program and choose a theme and pursue that theme and see and meet the people on the ground that I'm telling you about who are doing God's work every single day. And I just think that's a powerful, changing experience that would benefit us very much. But I'm sure there's plenty of other ideas, so maybe somebody has another idea of how do you build those bridges.
Back in April, our pastor Brian Smith talked about what we could do in our community locally in reaching out particularly to people of other faiths, Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, who have moved into Canton in large numbers. And I'm wondering, we are a relatively small church, a little over 200 members, but we put a lot of time and energy into building those kinds of relationships. And I'm wondering if there is a way we can reconcile doing that effectively and still do what you're advocating without stretching ourselves too thin and not doing as much as we might in either area.
I don't think I have any kind of universal answer to that question. I really think it needs to be decisions being made by the local community of faith about what its strengths and limitations are. And so the question is, what can you do where you are? Now, the danger of saying that is that we often limit ourselves way too much. So I do think that it's very possible to cross geography and race and class differences, and that we need that kind of stretching. But I don't think I want to lay on local churches or this presbytery that there's one answer to that question. I suspect that every community needs to look at the history of its community through what in academia we call a disaggregated lens. How did this history develop? Who was benefiting? Who was losing? What difference did gender make? What difference did class make? What happened to low-income people in your community? And what difference did race or ethnicity or religion make? Who's included and who's left out? That's what we mean by doing a theologically informed analysis of where you are.